Alrighty, here we are, session number 6 for ANZ Coders this year, Reactive UI with Mr. Brendan Forster, who I'm going to be polite to. I've given him enough of a ribbing before this, so
Are you sure, Richard? Are you sure?
No, not really. I'm sure there's more. The question is, are you wearing your dressing gown?
No, I'm not. I'm afraid. I'm just in regular clothes.
So no smoking jacket, no slippers,
No,
perhaps?
I don't own one of those, sadly. I should have invested in one. Yeah, sounds like a good touch.
Or maybe a Sherlock Holmes hat to put on just for fun. All right, I'm going to go mute myself. It's all over to you, dude.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, hello everyone. Hello Internet. For those of you who don't know me, I'm not famous rapper Kanye West, although he has some amazing quotes, which you'll see throughout my talk. Ultimately, I'm here to talk about Reactive UI. And I want to kind of go through 3 questions in particular. First off, why you should consider using this, the what, what's the deal with the app, and how to get started. So for those of you who haven't used Reactive UI at all, it's an MEVM framework for doing WPF and Xamarin-based apps, and also Windows Phone. I want to kind of open with this sort of, the word I'm looking for is kind of a eureka moment that I had not so long ago. Like, I'd been doing WPF apps since probably about 2008, like early WPF, and I kind of had this light bulb moment that came up around how we're changing how we're building apps. And the particular thing that I found was that how we deal with change is really key to this. Of course, the rise of JavaScript frameworks, they're also going down this path. What I found in particular was it was a change of mindset that came up. I work at GitHub, and between the Windows team and the Mac team, we call ourselves Team Desktop, and we build out apps using this concept called functional reactive programming. We basically bring time into the framework as a first-class concept. We have events that come through, and we build in functional programming to essentially design our apps. Now, this isn't a new concept. A paper that came through for ICFP in 1997 from Elliott and Hudak, they described this thing that they called functional reactive animation. And they built it out to describe a DSL based on Haskell for doing these frameworks. And the syntax that they came out with was actually really innovative for the time. Of course, with the rise of CPUs growing in terms of the power necessary to kind of do this sort of computing, we're finally now kind of able to tap into this stuff and do it at scale. So there's kind of 3 things that you get out of doing a code base in a functional reactive way. You get to make as much your code base immutable as possible. You get to put functions together to kind of compose them in a way that you get more advanced behaviors. And having events as a first-class feature leads to kind of more declarative code. And so as I walk through this, I'll show you how this stuff pervades Reactive UI because ultimately there's a lot to take in. But the example I want to start off with is just a clock. How would you draw this in terms of a simple GUI? We have the various hands, we have the shape in the background, and we're not going to do it in Reactive UI. We're going to do it in this little language called Elm. It's a compiled JavaScript framework that ultimately you can kind of just build the stuff out. It's, again, relatively new, but ultimately has a lot of interest in the web space. So coming back to our clock, we've got a couple of things moving around on the screen. We've got, the hour, the minute, and the second hand. We've got the clock face itself. Let's build this up from the very beginning. We need a function to draw the hand for a clock. We have the parameters that we pass in. We have an angle that we want to generate. Don't worry about the details, just kind of appreciate the concepts that come through. And we get to the end, we have this segment that we want to draw a length and an angle, and we want to then draw it on the screen using a given color. We then have a function called clock, which takes in this element t. Behind the scenes, we have a number of shapes we want to build out, and our hand function is here as well. We have the orange hand for the hour and the charcoal hand for the minute and the seconds. And of course, if you go up a bit further, we have the main function, which is just a signal, which I'll explain in a second, which runs this function called clock, from earlier, and we have this concept here called every second. So this is an example of how events can be a first-class feature in your applications. Signal is a popular term in functional reactive programming for basically raising an event or a stream of events rather. And so we have this little DSL here that says whenever, every second, we want to pass a signal to this function called clock. There's some extra glue on top around importing various namespaces, but for all intents and purposes, that's the code that you've got. Very simple, very easy to read. You can see events coming through. You can see how the declarative syntax falls out and how much actually mutable code there is. Like there's just the let in the middle and everything else is basically just static functions. So let's go to Reactive Extensions. So Reactive Extensions has been around for a while in terms of .NET. It's came from the guys who brought you Link ultimately, and it's what we use as part of the core of Reactive UI. Of course, I can't give a Reactive Extensions talk any sort of justice. If you want to go and find this talk, I'll put some links up in the notes from Eric Meyer, the father of Reactive Extensions. He kind of talks about how observables relate to enumerables. So I'm just going to give you a quick summary because ultimately we are so very tight on time. So observables are sort of the opposite, or the mathematical jewel, as a mouthful, the mathematical jewel of enumerables. Enumerables, you can pull items off until they're done. Observables are ultimately you receive events. So they kind of flip around like that. And ultimately what you do with an observable is you subscribe to it. And then you get some, basically pass in a function to kind of go through the results in the list. And ultimately at some point later, you want to kind of stop the subscription. And so you just dispose of it. But unlike enumerables, you also get options inside an observable for doing a completion callback and a exception callback. And so you get a whole bunch more control flow that you get with observables rather than enumerables. There's two sort of observables that you get when things come up. Cold observables will only give you events when subscribers are attached. Hot observables, if you imagine things firing constantly, they will just go through and signal like they don't care. With observables, you also have a whole bunch of link extensions under the hood. So you can start up or subscribe to an observable that satisfies a number of conditions. We've got skip here and where. If you're familiar with link, the syntax is very similar. Scheduling is also a first-class concept in observables. I can do some stuff in the background, and then I can update the UI on the dispatcher. Again, very declarative code coming through, and the stuff just reads rather well. Probably one of my favorite sites that I've just found recently is this site called RX Marbles. If you get overwhelmed with how all these streams come together and how the operators work, they basically just lay it out for you. So here's an example of an operator in observables called combine latest. I have two observables X and Y. As they get events coming through, I have this function which basically says, add the two values together. And so the bottom line gives you the result from the two observables. So visually seeing what these observables are doing. All right, so we've done Reactive UI, Reactive Extensions. Let's talk about Reactive UI. Yes, there are lots of frameworks out there for doing MVVM stuff. I spent way too long with Reactive UI to keep up with what's going on in that space, but let's have a little bit of a refresher. The key thing about MVVM is this thing called a view model, and it contains the data to show on the screen and the behavior that should occur around a piece of logic, essentially. There's no sort of UI associated with it, so ideally you can swap things out. This is the ideal stuff that Fowler was talking about, but ultimately that was the beginning, and lots of WPF stuff was inspired by Martin's writing. But for me, MVVM is just these two pieces, data binding and commanding. So when values change in the view model, they update in the UI. When something on the view happens, the command fires on the view model. But the thing that I love about Reactive UI is that asynchronous stuff is first class. I'm sure that there's been other improvements in other frameworks, but ultimately I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to talk about the stuff that we've got here. So there's this conundrum that we've got. We've got these observables that raise events, but we've also got these properties on views, which are essentially just getters and setters. How do we map these things together to make it A, sane, actually B, usable? So I'm going to walk you through an example using Reactive UI, which is just around a simple login button. We have two properties on our view model, the username and the password. What we want is we want to enable the form when the user has filled out some details. If it's empty, we don't want to do any of that stuff. So when any is one of the really, really awesome parts of Reactive UI. It allows you to pass in a number of expressions, and when they change, they get evaluated. So I've just annotated this one here to show you a bit more of the detail. When the username is updated or the password is updated, we run some sort of function, and that gets transformed into an observable. What I can do with this observable is then map this to a view model property. The top section is something you add in your constructor, and then you just have this property. Again, it's read-only, so that's more of the mutability stuff. That becomes the backing store for the view model property. And so as this thing changes, the observable as property helper receives those updates, and it signals to the view that these things have changed. Very simple, well, once you get the hang of it, of course, but we'll get to that later. And you just kind of, basically, your view models turn into a lot more immutable. And this is something that I kind of find myself fighting with a lot of the current tooling that's out there. There's this pattern in .NET where constructors need to be simple. Even though I have these very complex view models in various applications themselves, they're not that complex. Reactive UI takes care of all of the heavy lifting, and then I just have lots of expressions to describe what my app is doing. Again, things like ReSharper and even Visual Studio itself really freak out about this. I don't know of a way to fix this aside from just muting warnings, and I feel kind of bad, but that's life. And so commanding, I won't go into my whole entire rant about how commanding is terrible, but I will just tell you about the stuff that Reactive UI adds on top of commanding. For those who don't know any of the XAML technologies, these are the two parameters you get when you implement a command: can execute and void. Execute doesn't give you anything back to tell you when it's done. It's literally fire and forget, and can execute, yeah, that's the less terrible of the two. So this is a simple command in Reactive UI. There's no sort of custom class to implement. It's just a factory method to create the stuff that you want. You can also pass in an observable, an observable of type Boolean that indicates when the command should be enabled. So you don't have to define your own custom types. You just pass it this expression that's observable. Again, more observables everywhere. And what you work out is, well, Reactive command takes care of enabling and disabling the command. There's also support for asynchronous actions in your command. If you have a task or an observable, we have overloads in Reactive UI to just pass those through. And what's really cool about having these commands set up that return a result is that I can use those results back in my view model. I don't need to worry about setting things. I don't need to worry about managing that state. I just have a subscription that then I can map to whatever's going on in my application. Testability of commands is also pretty terrible, but there's an overload for Reactive Command where you can refresh, well, you basically get a observable of, what's an observable of? I just think it's an observable of Boolean. And so you await on the observable to complete, and then you can step through to the rest of your test. Fun fact for those of you who don't know, you can await on observables as well as tasks. I should blog on about this because it's actually pretty cool. Yeah, it's the same experience for both. If you have an action in your Reactive command that throws up an error, you don't need to worry about catching that internally. You can just, oops, sorry, that was me. You don't need to worry about catching that internally. You can actually hook into, again, an observable of type exception off the command itself and do those loggings there. Ah, my favorite feature of commands. Who has ever done a loading, a spinner animation in their applications? Let's say I'm going off to refresh a user in the background. I want to indicate when that's done. This is most of the code that I need to do that. I have a command that's set up. I have a property off the command called isExecuting, and then I can map that to a property on my view model. There's a little bit of glue. Again, our observable is probably a helper behind the scene. But ultimately, that's all the code that I need. And that takes care of the false to true transition where the command fires, the true to false transition when it finishes. Again, really simple code and really powerful stuff once you get the hang of it. And this was actually something that came into, well, more recently in terms of Reactive UI's history, is as they went through more cross-platform issues. They kind of wanted a way to do consistent bindings. And so when I talk about different platforms, I'm talking about the Mono platform, the Xamarin platforms, the WPF platforms, and all that. And ultimately, what they came through was something kind of based off WPF, but I'll show you how you go through implementing that. So here's a simple user control. Ultimately, what I need to do here, I need to implement this marker interface, iView4. There's a backing property, yay dependency properties, that needs to be set up as well. But ultimately, I write my bindings in my code behind in the constructor, and we go through what those look like. So here's a two-way binding in Reactive UI. I have a property on my view model. I map that to a property on the in the view on a control itself, and that's it. I can also do one-way binding, and here's another little nugget about Reactive UI. We have inbuilt converters. So I don't think I've actually written a decent converter in a long time. I just find myself hooking into Reactive UI to do all those transforms. So Boolean to visibility, one of the classic converters of WPF. Don't need to do that anymore. It's built into Reactive UI. Binding to commands is also very easy. And activation. So there's various sort of rules about platforms about how views and view models get activated. You just write this in Reactive UI, and the underlying platform takes care of running this code. So if I wanted to defer some bindings, I pass them into this function when activated, and ultimately they get set as late as possible. They don't get set up front. And also, you actually have when any available to you whenever you're doing stuff in your code behind. Yes, I know code behind is bad and you should feel bad, but ultimately I prefer this over doing stuff in XAML because, hey, I get types. So this is a little example here of when the view model has selected a repository, and I'm in a scenario where we're doing some filtering on the repository list. I just pass those details through, and then I can work out in my view the item I need to update. And so I have a few more minutes left based off of my 25. I'm going to talk about the stuff that Reactive UI is kind of intimidating to new users, and the stuff that we're doing as I say the royal we because I'm kind of half on the edge and involved with this stuff. I guess what stuff to watch out for and what stuff's challenging. So new user experience. This has been something that we've been wrestling with for ages. You kind of need, well, there's a lot of concepts to take on as you kind of see through that quick blast that we've gone through. Ultimately, how do you get these users to fall into the pit of success when there's all these new things to take on and all these things to consider? I'm going to call out Jeffrey, who is probably hanging around in the chat room right now. He's been the docs champion. I'll give you a link to the docs site later, but ultimately we've kind of settled on we need this user experience and we need it written down, because ultimately there are people in our head or people hanging around whose knowledge we need to capture for everyone else to enjoy. And so Jeffrey's been heads down on that, and yeah, we have some chats occasionally about stuff. It's pretty good. Tooling and debugging. As much as we give Visual Studio developers grief, the tooling experience for them is actually really amazing, and Visual Studio 2015 continues down that path. How open source frameworks like Reactive UI make that experience easy is something we need to tackle. One little example which I will kind of mention in passing is an experiment by one of my colleagues, Marcus, a way to look at observables in your application in real time. Ultimately, it's not quite ready for production. He kind of just knocked up this little app to prove that it's possible. But ultimately, stuff like this is things that we really need to help, performance testing, debugging, all those things that come with a robust library. We do need those at some point in the future. And lastly, sort of the mindset around this change from kind of thinking in a synchronous way to thinking about multi-threaded GUI development. I don't know how you do this beyond experience and good mentoring, which is actually kind of what we have set up recently. We have a Reactive UI Slack room where people can hang out. Lots of people who contribute to Reactive UI come in and then just hang out. This has been a great way to kind of just distill the knowledge and for people to follow along and ask questions. Stack Exchange, sorry, not Stack Exchange, Stack Overflow is kind of another one of those platforms that come with a lot of questions. But for sort of like more two-way discussions on stuff, we just love Slack for doing this stuff. I'm cruising at the moment. I gather some people have questions. I see some troublemakers hanging out in the room, so I'm going to drop and leave you with this lovely Kanye quote. And of course, some other links. So the main site, Reactive UI, the docs site, which is a work in progress, but there's still a lot of goodness already there. And if you want to kind of hang out in the Slack room and you don't already have an invite, give me a shout on Twitter. Any questions? David is asking if Reactive UI is an alternative to MVVM Lite or Calibre Micro. Yes, yes it is. You can actually use them alongside. So for example, one of the classes I didn't mention in the talk was Reactive Object. So that's kind of its implementation of I know if I property changed, but there's all this extra stuff on top of it that's based off Reactive Object. You could drop that into your project and use it alongside, just kind of get the hang of it and experiment with it. You don't need to kind of swap out one for the other. Actually, on one of the code bases I look after, we still have bits of Calibre and Micro hanging around. So yeah, you can use them alongside.
Cool. Well, I'll ask questions so you can then just concentrate on answering them and looking intelligent. So apparently there's a question from Jeffrey that says it's not a question. There's a Slack campfire for Reactive UI where the community chills. Is there a question here? It's just a statement.
No,
so
he's just sending through links. So Jeffrey's the guy in my talk who was doing the docs contributions.
Which is what the other question is as well. So we're going to have to go to the chat room then to see stuff. Now, I know you ripped through that like 25 minutes, cover the entire universe as quick as you can. So I think people might be catching their breath.
That's fine.
So what are the good sample apps that are using this behind the scenes open source stuff that have got real world?
GitHub, sorry, I'm going to stop screen sharing and switch over to chat. So GitHub for Windows is a big user of Reactive UI. It happens that the original contributor, well, the guy who started Reactive UI was working for us, so we did a lot of use of that. There's also a lot of Xamarin style applications out there that are using it. In terms of good demo apps, that's something that Jeffrey and I need to talk about. Oh, there's another question over there about messages. So messaging itself, there is a message bus implementation in Reactive UI, but it's not gotten a lot of love, and that's probably because it doesn't have a lot of interest in it. You can basically, it's kind of like the Calibre, actually no, Calibre Micros iHandle is what we use rather than the Reactive UI one. It's there, but no one really kind of likes it, so it's kind of languishing.
You can turn your video camera on, by the way, if we want us to see you. No, you just stop screen sharing.
Sorry.
That's you. All right, other questions, chat room, crazy people. Otherwise, if you think Brendan did a good job and he's awesome, you can do the virtual clap.
The round of applause. Dear.
Yes, Jeff's posting more links.
I know that. Yeah, that's cool. The Reactive UI contributors are hanging out.
Lovely. So it's good to know that the community is there to correct you when you publicly embarrass yourself.
Oh yes, yeah, and they will. They will. In not a nice way at all. Nah, they're good.
Pub sub messaging versus Observables. Is that a statement or a question, or just something to comment on?
I have written a pub sub framework on top of Observables, so I've done like the best or worst of both worlds, if you want to call it that. It's a standalone library that you can like. Yeah, it's a thing.
Okay. And apart from that, looks like we're getting the applause coming through.
And applause.
So we're going to say, as far as this session is done, and as far as tonight, night number 2 is done, tomorrow night is possibly dressing out, maybe a scarf as well, depending on the temperature where you are. I don't have a pipe or a smoking jacket. I might, put on a flannel set of pajamas or something as well, just for extra class. No, you're shaking your head. I shouldn't do that. All right, think first, think first. But apart from that, guys, thank you very much for joining us for yet another session. And tomorrow night, just to quickly give you the intro for what's coming, we've got Mr. Eckers, Philip Ekberg, doing C# is the future. I thought it was the present and the past as well, but apparently it's the future too. We're doing some machine learning. Ooh. So Skynet with Poya, and Daniel, who is going to be in the chat room at the moment, is going to be doing some async and await stuff. The secrets of. All right. So with that silliness out of the way, thank you very much. We'll see you again tomorrow night. And Origin's on for those in New South Wales and Queensland. I apologize for that. I didn't realize ahead of time that Origin was on. So I'm going to punish myself and actually have to press record and then watch it after the sessions are over. And the rest of you who don't care about sport are probably going, why? Who cares? I care. And we'll see you all tomorrow night. Until then, we're out of here.